In the 1980s and the 90s, with the seminal films such as Zhang Yimou's The Story of Qiuju Da Guanxi in Chinese, the concepts embodied in the concept of universal human rights began to gain wider currency in the new modern China. At the same time, the country was emerging from poverty and leading many millions of people to be able to take for granted a more stable and prosperous life, unknown for many decades previously. This balance between the drive for progress as a society and the protection of the individual continues to be focus of policy, hard work and debate. China's State Council Information Office recently published a white paper titled Progress in Human Rights Over the 40 Years of Reform and Opening Up in China. To discuss this progress and the many complex issues surrounding its pursuit, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Professor Zhang Wei, co-director of Institute for Human Rights at China University of Political Science and Law, and Liu Huawen, executive director of Center for Human Rights Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. We shall also speak via satellite to Fraser Cameron, director of the EU Asia Center in Brussels. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to our discussion here. Professor Zhang, as I said earlier in the opening remarks, Qiuju Da Guanxi, a popular movie in the early 1990s, impressed the Chinese audiences about why this ordinary woman in a village was so determined to ask for justice. This sense of justice started to emerge and cross the minds of the ordinary folks in China. So, were you impressed by the story?
Yes, I mean, indeed. It was also happened in my home province.
In your home province
yes,
of Xi'an?
The story, in Shanxi province, yes. There was also an interesting story after this movie. A lady, she happened to be shot by the movie. And when she got to know that she was in the movie, because she was a laid-off worker, she was working, selling things on the street. And she was not happy about the movie because she was shot without any consent from her. So she was asking for compensation from the movie company.
But this case was so different from a photo that won Pulitzer Prize for an American GI to kiss a French lady in the street of Paris. And that also caused controversies. So the China story is not so romantic. But let's come back to examine this white paper. What do you think are the important points that we want to call attention to?
I see the white paper published today is the very latest one, comprehensively covering the human rights achievements and human rights process over the 4 decades. That is the very period of reform and opening up of China. And we could see the human rights development in China is quite successful, and very obviously, just as the stories tell us, is the human rights not just concepts as legal terms in written form, but also in daily life. They could be seeable, they could be felt.
Are you guys aware of the growing awareness shared by most members of the middle-income families to defend their rights? They are taxpayers, they are the middle class, they are well-educated, they have a stable job, and they want to have a decent life. At the same time, they say, oh, my properties need to be protected, and I have the right to fight corruption and to promote transparency about how the money should be used by the government. So what do you think of this growing awareness?
It grows with the opening up of Chinese society, with several different helps from international organizations, different countries. For example, from the early 80s, China has ratified several human rights treaties. It becomes legally binding on Chinese government. For that reason, Chinese government also delivered government reports to the different human rights treaty bodies. And also later on, we have the Universal Periodical Review from the United Nations. So Chinese government is also under legal obligation to deliver a government report every 4 years' time. So this is a very good exercise for not only Chinese government officials but also promote a very high awareness among people.
Signing the important international treaties is one thing. To have verification of such documents by the National People's Congress, the top legislature, is quite another. Can you brief us on the progress in this regard?
Yes, till now we have ratified 26 international human rights treaties, and according to our national laws, we need to integrate the international standards into our national laws and make them applied in our daily life. Meanwhile, in China, we have adopted many policy documents to carry out our international obligations under the human rights treaties, especially the National Human Rights Action Plan. It's a specific governmental action plans for human rights purposes.
Signing the documents, the verification of those treaties, fine, sounds fine. But what about the execution and supervision of such implementation in China?
So for that reason, you can see the Chinese government also issued several national human rights action plans to implement at the government level all the international obligations. And also at the same time, Chinese government has been promoting human rights education at different levels of educational institutions, including party schools of Chinese Communist Party. So this is very massive human rights education, has raised the whole awareness of people in China.
Thank you so much. Let me go to Fraser Cameron, our European panelist who's standing by in Brussels. Hello, Fraser. Now, a few years ago, late Ambassador Wu Jianmin, who was Chinese ambassador to France, said he attended many of the United Nations Human Rights Conference in Geneva. And some of the anti-China bills were submitted by the US delegation, and they were all defeated by the Chinese delegation, along with friends from developing countries. He's proud of this track record, but what do you think of the enormous efforts that China has made over the past 40 years in trying to improve the basic, or you would like to call them, universal human rights in this, second biggest economy, Fraser?
Well, there is a substantial difference in the interpretation of human rights. If we look at the economic and social rights, then China has made a dramatic improvement, probably without precedent in history over the last 40 years, lifting 700 million plus people out of poverty and raising the standard of living. It's really impressive. But China's also takes a different view at the moment on universal human rights, individual human rights, and as do many other Asian countries. So that's why we have a difference of opinion between Europe and China on some of these questions.
In the United States, Americans would tend to confrontation approach in addressing the issue of human rights, but we got the feeling that Europeans prefer to have a dialogue with the Chinese. Now, can you brief us on the progress, if any?
Well, we have an annual EU-China human rights dialogue, which is alternates between Beijing and Brussels. It's pretty frank and open in terms of each side spelling out the issues that they want to raise and also raising some concerns with the other. So I think that's good. In addition, there's some activity at the UN, both in New York and Geneva, where the two sides meet and discuss human rights. And there's, of course, increasing contact between civil society when some of these issues are raised. So I think it's a mutual educational process between the EU and China, each pointing out, where the other is coming from, and each side trying to better understand the problems of the other.
Fraser, earlier you mentioned differences between the European side and the Chinese views about the human rights, and particularly definition. And I'm actually referring to political participation. But can you brief us on those issues in dispute between the two sides, the European perspective and the Chinese angles?
Well, the European side puts more emphasis on the individual human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the rule of law, I mean, these are constitutional issues which, in fact, China has signed up to with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. China has signed but not ratified the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, for example. So these are some of the areas of dispute between the EU and China. I mean, there are people who say this is a question simply of economic development. If you look at many other countries, after a certain level of economic development, countries tend to operate a sort of a more liberal society. And at the moment, that is not the case with China. But as I say, one should not underestimate the huge progress that China has made in terms of, the economic improvements which affect everybody in China.
Professor Zhang, do you agree that those are the points, the case in point? And what else do you think should be highlighted about the differences?
I don't agree that we do not accept universal human rights. It's totally different. No, I think we recognize the importance of universal human rights. In many of other political areas, we may have different approach to deal with these problems, but does not mean that Chinese government is not recognizing universal human rights. And on top of that,
excuse me, by universality of human rights, do you actually mean human rights know no boundary? It's in fact one of the famous quotes by Kofi Annan, late leader of the United Nations.
Yes, and also if you read the Chinese National Human Rights Action Plan, you realize that China has been closely following the UN calling for mainstreaming of human rights in all areas of social of the society management. So I think this is coming. Also, if you talk about China with foreign diplomats, Beijing is always, China is always a good spot for foreign diplomats to come. You know why? Because it's a safe place to go. And why is it safe?
Is Beijing the only safest place in China?
No, it
where
has
you don't have robbers, theft?
It enjoys very high rate of safety.
Very different from South Africa, by the way.
Yeah.
Police chief of Johannesburg said to me in the interview, Yang Rui, Johannesburg is perhaps the most dangerous city in the world, despite the democracy that was first adopted in the middle of the 1990s under the leadership of Nelson Mandela, who won Nobel Peace Prize, and I respect him so much.
Yeah, if China is not a place respecting all the human rights, how can China become a safe place? How can ordinary people be happy with the society? We may have problems. Every society has problems. It does not mean that we don't recognize universal human rights.
And I'd like to know more from you guys as to what happened in the late 1980s when the National People's Congress passed a law which is called Village Committee, Organic Law of Village Committee Elections. Despite the political upheavals in 1989, Mr. Peng Zhen, chairman of the Standing Committee of the NPC, still pushed for elections in villages to elect village chiefs that the villagers trust into office and to promote transparency of the financing. I mean, that was very impressive. I interviewed former US President Jimmy Carter on occasions of village elections. So why do you think these days the media in China seldom mention the village elections? Do you think we have more setbacks than success stories concerning the rural democracy?
You are quite right. I think it's a typical political right, and it related to the participation in public life, and especially it's the rights of the villagers, very poor term, and relating to so many Chinese peasants. For China, we are kind of cautious to push the reforms, but at least we think we need to promote human rights comprehensively. So my understanding is China, together with other countries, we share the human rights dream, the human rights common goals. The difference, what is the difference? The difference is how to do it, how to carry out the tasks. So for China, we said we combine the universal human rights standards together or add the Chinese reality. So that's our own way to answer the demands of the people of the society. So gradually but steadily, we enlarge the realization of the political rights.
Today, the Chinese parents are allowed to have more than one child. However, birth rate starts to decline in first and second tier cities. The younger generation are reluctant to be parents, and many of them choose to be single without any, or even getting married. So there were a lot of stories, Fraser. Let me go back to Fraser. There were a lot of stories in the Western media reports about violations of human rights concerning family planning, but don't you think the Chinese government is also clearly aware of the vulnerabilities, of the shortcomings, the risks in the implementation of the one-child policy?
Yes, I think that's why they called an end to it. I mean, the problem, which perhaps nobody foresaw, was that you have a surplus of, what, 4 or 5 million men in China now who don't have any prospect of getting married. So that's, you know, can be a serious social problem if it's not addressed. So I think it was right to change the policy. At the same time, you had to take some measures, perhaps, to limit population, simply to deal with the huge economic and social problems that were necessary 20 years ago. That's changed now, so I think the policy is rightly changed.
For example, the Hope Project for education of left behind children and care or Medicare for the elderly, the retirees. That could also be something that the Chinese government deserves a right, the Chinese government deserves credit for the progress. Now let's look at other areas where we have embarrassment, but we have at the same time progress. What are the things that you think should be an important part of the China story concerning human rights that you want the rest of the world to learn to promote the transparency? For example, court hearing. For example, trials. How justice is done in the system of the judiciary in China. It might be a little bit controversial that China doesn't have the Western sense of judicial independence, but tell me at least the issue of transparency concerning trials in the court.
In many court proceedings, if it's suitable for public hearing, you can actually see that from watch the court proceeding on the internet. So this is a very massive progress in this area. So people can listen and can read what happens in the court. So this itself is a supervision over the judges.
Can ordinary people have easy access to the archives, the files of all the court trials if they like?
Yeah, in this regard, according to some Chinese scholars, the progress is revolutionary due to the use of new technology, especially the big data and internet. So the Supreme Court have set up 4 databases, so all the people have access to the decisions, the rulings of the courts at different levels. So it's suddenly it's open to the society, and this transparency is promoted quite effectively.
Following the heavy fines of ZTE, what the United States does to Huawei starts to capture headlines today, and the stories as such start to go viral on the internet. Now, Fraser, many Chinese netizens in their millions accuse President Donald Trump of using Meng Wanzhou, CFO of Huawei, as a hostage, as a part of the deal to address the issue of trade imbalance. Now, what do you think of this alleged violation of Ms. Meng Wanzhou's human rights?
Well, she was caught up in extradition demand by the United States, which other countries who've signed up to international extradition agreements have to follow. So Canada basically had no choice there, and it's now going through the Canadian courts. I think it's an exaggeration to say it's an example of violation of human rights, but you may be right in terms of, you know, using it as a pressure point. in terms of the trade dispute between the US and China. And of course many Europeans can be caught up in this too, because the legislation that the Americans have put forward dealing with Iran affects companies all over the world and individuals who are operating with Iran. So Europeans are completely opposed to this extraterritorial sanctions regime of the United States as well.
Are you saying, Fraser, that domestic laws of the United States should not be universally applicable, and Europeans find it difficult to accept the what you call extraterritorial application of their laws?
Absolutely.
Professor Zhang.
Absolutely.
Yes, Professor Zhang, what do you think of the controversies surrounding the extraterritorial laws of the United States?
I can only agree with Fraser that what he said. From what the information we received, it's very hard to judge that there are any human rights violations in the proceeding. But U.S. is making a very bad start for international trade, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Do you agree that Meng Wanzhou, a daughter of Ren Zhengfei, president of Huawei, has been used as a bargaining chip? And some netizens in China went as far as to suggest this is none other than a hostage-taking approach.
I think it's a legal case, so we need
to
consider it from the legal perspectives. A lawyer, I think, I agree that the behavior of Canada and U.S. is quite questionable, and it's quite reasonable for our authority to take diplomatic measures and other legal measures to help the individuals and our own company.
Fraser, once again, let me go back to the case of Meng Wanzhou, because this is so sensational. It sends shockwaves across the country and perhaps the rest of the world. Some of the Chinese netizens compare the arrest of Meng Wanzhou to a kind of a detention of the daughter of Steve Jobs, okay, a founding father of Apple and iPhone empire. They say it's low, mean, and politically incorrect to use a woman as the bargaining chip, and they go to the parallel comparison. Well, this of course has a lot of implications concerning the bilateral trade standoff. I'd like to have the European perspective from an objective and a third-party perspective.
Well, Europeans are completely opposed to Trump's use of, firstly, tariffs, and then these overall bullying measures in terms of how to resolve trade disputes. The EU position has always been very clear. You try and resolve them through the WTO. There's a mechanism for that called the dispute settlement mechanism, which America is trying to undermine at the moment by refusing to appoint new appellate judges to make the system work. So that's the European perspective. Obviously, from time to time, individuals are caught up in this. I think in this case, it was, and I don't know all the details, an allegation that she had somehow been involved in a subsidiary that had been trading with Iran against American sanctions. And so therefore that was why the demand for extradition was made. What the exact facts are about the case, I really don't know more than that.
One of the major concerns on the agenda of the European side concerning human rights might be transparency of IPR protection. You have followed this issue for many years, Fraser. Can you share your discovery about either progress or setbacks on the Chinese side to protect intellectual property rights?
Well, I think there has been progress. Some people say it's not sufficient. The demand often comes from joint venture partners to say we must have the latest technology, otherwise you're not going to get access to the Chinese market. And this was also used in the 1970s and 80s by the Japanese, for example, with American and European partners. So it's not just something that the Chinese have done. I think now China has developed to a state where in terms of research, development, intellectual property, they're on a par with some of the best IT companies in the world. So I don't think it's really the same level of problem that it was perhaps 10 years ago.
Thank you so much. That's the analysis of Fraser Cameron about the protection of intellectual property rights. We imported a lot of advanced or state-of-art technologies from Western countries when it comes to chips, semiconductors. However, since the United States has started to take China as the biggest threat to their national security, starts to ban sales of Huawei products in the U.S. market. Now, do you think, given the broad context of a global chain or high-value added chains the world over, it's difficult to fight this trade war? I mean, China starts to pour more money into R&D. We focus on the issue of intellectual property rights. I'm not sure if I have made this clear to you.
What I want to say is it's quite obviously that over the decades the situation is being changed a lot. The change is now we benefit from protection of IP rights, not just contribute to it, or we are requested to do that. Now we need to create innovation, and we encourage creative activities. So now it's our need. And materially, now the families, the individuals, they could afford this. They could buy authentic DVD, not just we need high quality goods. So that's in daily life we could see the change. The attitude of the public is improved a lot actually.
Each year, more than 100 million Chinese tourists, outbound tourism occurs. A part of that result, I'm afraid, is to know more about the Western civilizations, their advanced lifestyle. However, recent days, the Yellow Vests protests in the streets of Paris and other cities of France captured headlines. By the end of the day, we find ourselves asking whether there should be a limit of how far you can go in protecting your rights. I mean, if protests become violent, using means to sabotage public properties, I mean, that could seriously go wrong. What do you think of the French awareness of their rights? It seems whenever they are unhappy, they will take to the street in protest. At the same time, do you think there should be a limit to what the government should do? Now, each side should know the boundaries. That's what we tend to say in analyzing the issue of rights.
Yeah, it's a very important issue, as you mentioned, that for many countries, especially for Western countries, developed countries, they have the means to provide a higher social security for the society. But most of the time, states do not want to share the wealth with ordinary people. So when they are not able to reach the balance, there will be a problem. So it's very important that for the government to recognize this problem and come up with a good solution for that.
Quite a few years ago, I was interviewing Tony Blair, former British Prime Minister. I asked the question about why he was criticized by British voters on his encouraging invasion of Iraq, despite the seriously flawed intelligence reports ahead of the invasion. He said that politicians need to make unpopular decisions despite the dismay of voters. Well, we have a lot to discuss. Perhaps I would invite Professor Zhang and other fellows to come over and address this interesting issue about human rights. China should not feel so sensitive about the importance of human rights, particularly the universality of this issue. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.